sure that anti-racism underpins all of those struggles from the off.
Thank you, Adam. Hi, I'm Becca Hudson. I am involved in various campaigns, including at the moment Fuck Boris. You can buy this t-shirt on our website. Sorry, I had to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are now in terms of our kind of current politics, and also what the response then is from our movement more generally, with a couple of practical examples from our organising. So I think that there was, despite the fact that Theresa May was no doubt a racist and presided over some of the most brutally aggressive racist policies that we've seen in this country, including the deportation of British citizens just because they were black, and the hostile environment producing an entire subsection of our society that are forced into destitution, fear and terror by the state. I also think that there has been a step change since Boris Johnson has taken office, partly in his administration's kind of knowing wink wink nudge nudge towards a far right base. And you see now members of openly fascistic far right groups on the streets agitating for Boris Johnson, in a way that they were agitating against Theresa May and for people like Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson. Not that they've stopped agitating for Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson, but they see Boris Johnson as their hero, and he knows that. And there are many ways in which, even when he's just doing these kind of performative, playing to the public gallery type moves and posturing, he is knowingly doing that towards this far right base who support him. And also, as Adam touched on, I think, you know, we have to continue to be mindful of the fact that that's happening in a global context of a growing far right across the world, and it's a very serious threat. So in terms of the response that we have, I think that, again, as Adam talked about, there has been obviously an erosion of working class power in this country over the past 30, 40 years. And part of that erosion has also been an erosion of our ability to collectively fight racism. And we have to understand, and you know, I think that many of the reasons that people find Jeremy Corbyn such an inspiring leader is because of his integrity in anti-racist principles and anti-imperial principles throughout his time as an MP. And part of people's complete abhorrence towards the Blair Project was Blair's racism, right? It was the Iraq War, it was the law and order policies, it was the Blairite introduction of things like detention centres that we are now fighting to shut down. But I think we have to be mindful that we can't make those compromises again. So, as Adam has said, there is not an anti-austerity and social justice movement that does not confront racism. And I think we have a bit of a way to go to do that. We can't make the mistake of capitulating to law and order policies, partly because it's just a strategic failure, right? Like, Boris Johnson will just call for 20,000 more police, and we've seen it fail strategically, as well as it being a political failure of a social justice movement that does not confront the tools of law and order and the tools of borders, which are tools of class war. And the working class in this country is not going to be able to be free and to live in an equal and just society unless those tools are seriously confronted by our movement. So in terms of our kind of internal movement as well, I think that there has been, over those 30, 40 years, an increasing kind of division of communities and a siloing of different oppressions, which sometimes mystifies the way in which race is operating structurally and aggressively in our society all of the time, and also means that we are less well equipped to be able to collectively fight these injustices. So just as a couple of practical examples, one of the projects which I've been involved in for the past couple of years is feminist anti-fascism. We saw the way in which the far right in this country were increasingly talking about sexual violence as a way of mobilising their supporters, and they were building quite a serious base of far-right men and women who were worried about the threat of this criminal other who was coming to rape our women. And we thought that there had to be an explicitly feminist response to that, both in terms of kind of messaging, but also on the streets. And so on October of last year, we mobilised 5,000 people to stand and block the Democratic Football Lads Alliance from marching on Whitehall. And that was a demonstration that was led by feminists, and it was an explicitly feminist response. And it scared them, and it disrupted some of the messaging which they were using to mobilise. And we managed to do that through a kind of coalition of different groups. And I think this is an important principle that we take forward in collective anti-racist organising, that within the feminist anti-fascist group itself, we didn't have everyone that we needed, but we worked with Brazilian Women Against Fascism who were agitating against Bolsonaro in the UK. We worked with the Kurdish women's movement, and we managed to build this coalition which was able to bring out thousands of people on the street. And they were afraid and worried about what would happen because, you know, they were pelting us with beer cans and screaming abuse in our faces. But we were only able to do that by reaching out across two different communities. And although we were not all fighting the exact same struggle, for that moment we were able to build power, we built relationships, and we managed to mobilise a response which pushed back on the kind of far-right narrative that they were mobilising with. The other example I just wanted to talk about was the way in which we're able, not just by promoting Labour and the Labour movement for taking more explicitly anti-racist politics from the state, but that we're able to agitate against state racism now. And so this is some of the work that I do with Adam, particularly on the way in which this phenomena of knife crime is being kind of pulled up and used to justify more and more draconian policing. And we're able to work with young people who experience the brunt of this kind of aggressive and racist policing tactics, and also with drill artists whose music is being criminalised because we're being told that their YouTube videos make people go out and kill other people. And that again comes from a kind of a commitment to working across communities and looking in the way in which we can target through law, through open letters, through building relationships with lots of groups of young people against the way in which state racism is presenting itself in the lives of people today. So just to kind of the take-home message is that I think that the way that we can confront this right now is by a commitment to working together across communities, using a diversity of tactics so that we're dealing with racists when they are in 10 Downing Street, and we are dealing with racists when they are pelting beer cans at people on the street. And that we support the grassroots groups and build our own grassroots groups who are doing this confrontational work now, because that is the infrastructure that's going to enable us to fight Boris Johnson. It's the infrastructure that's going to enable us to win an election on an explicitly anti-racist platform. And whatever happens after the coming election, it will enable us to keep the society just, equal and free for every member of the working class, not just the white working class.
Thank you. I feel there's not much to say after that. You guys were both brilliant. I just saw the sign over there. My name is Rafeef Ziadah, by the way. I'm a Palestinian anti-racist activist, and I teach in London somewhere. I saw the sign over there that says, "Be nice to the volunteers." So I wanted to say thank you to all the volunteers. Quite often you see the people on the platforms, but not everyone doing behind the work scenes. And this work is often very gendered, making sure there's water on the table. So thank you all. I woke up this morning and I saw this beautiful song, just a few Sudanese activists on the street singing to Egyptian activists saying, "Go home, Sisi," because there's been protests for the past 2 days in Egypt and various cities in Egypt saying we've had enough of Sisi. So the uprisings are still ongoing. And the reason I wanted to start with Egypt and Sudan, of course, because the Sudanese people have been remarkable in their uprising, and so have the Algerian people. But in my view, you cannot speak about anti-racism in one country. The thing about anti-racism is that it has always been internationalist and anti-imperialist. I think the anti-racist slogan, "We are here because you are there," really captures how anti-racism works. The fact that there have always been migrants here. British Empire affected us not just in the past, but it lives on in every moment in the present. Like Adam said, it lives in every stone of every building that we walk through, in the statues that are still celebrated, but it's a history that we are denied. It's a history that we're not supposed to understand. I was saying yesterday, sometimes I teach students, they've gone through the entire education system in this country, and they don't know a thing about colonialism. Recently, I did what they call the Life in England test, where you have to do it to pass that you've become a person who can live in this country. I read this very thick book. I had to learn all of Henry's wives in order. That's what you have to learn. One of the questions was, what do British people eat on Christmas? And you had to learn that it's turkey and cranberry. And there were 2 lines about colonialism. There was an orderly transition, and then it was over. Now that tells you quite a lot about how the country thinks of itself and how the history of the country is written. And I think without a reckoning of the fact that British Empire lives on, and the fact that colonial capitalism lives on, and that it was built on a history of slavery and genocide, without that reckoning, we cannot really speak about anti-racism. And in the same token, we cannot speak about anti-austerity if we're not speaking about anti-racism. And I think all I have to say on that is one word: Grenfell Tower. Because if anyone still thinks the two are not connected and we can have austerity and welfare for the few and not the many, then I have to question, who are the many that you are speaking about? And I think if we're at something called the world transformed, then let's transform our own understandings and challenge ourselves about who do we think are the many? Who do we think is deserving of welfare and who isn't? Who is counted within the many and who isn't? And then we start pushing our anti-austerity politics to be about much more than tweaking the economy on the sides, fixing a little bit here, nationalizing a train there, but actually fundamentally, systemically challenging institutionalized racism and the history of empire within this country. So for me, that is one of the principles that we have to work around. The fact that austerity might have come here recently, but it has been around the world for a very long time. And people of countries in the global north have been the beneficiaries. That has to be reckoned with. There's no such thing as anti-austerity in one place when you have an economy here that's built on a history of empire, but a continuing empire. A dismantling of the state all over the world that benefited countries like this. The welfare state did not come about because someone felt, oh, we just want to give people a few extra things. It came about because there was decolonization in the rest of the world and movements here as well. And we have to remember that connection. And from that principle directly flows the fact that if we want anti-racism in this country, we have to dismantle the war economy of this country. The fact that corporations benefit so much from the sale of arms and the destruction of other countries, these foreign policies that are built here are essentially racist. If you look at what a country like Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, it is absolutely shameful. People often speak about the war in Iraq, and we went out on the streets for the war in Iraq, and the anti-war movement was remarkable. But countries like Saudi Arabia are being openly funded by this government, openly funded. The arms trade is continuing. And of course, countries like Israel are being openly funded. Now, if we're going to be anti-racist, one of the fundamental things we have to take on is the arms trade, making sure the arms trade is dismantled. Not just, oh, there's human rights violations here or human rights violations there, but actually to look at what does it mean that there's an industry in this country that is built on the destruction, I mean bombing people to smithereens, of other parts of the world. We have to reckon with that. And it's a tough question. When it comes to practical organizing, so we've done a lot of organizing around companies like Elbit and their factories that are scattered around here. It's an Israeli company, it makes drones. And when we go out to these factories to try and shut them down, people say, well, what about the workers in these factories? How do you speak to the workers? Don't we need jobs? How about jobs? If the jobs are built on the fact that you're killing people somewhere else, that's a problem. But also, we can change the jobs. These industries can be doing something else, something productive, something helpful, something that actually helps the planet rather than bombs other people. And if that's a conversation we need to have with the trade unions, then let's have that conversation openly and honestly. And that's something the labor movement needs to be doing. I think in terms of the labor movement, something that it's been really behind on and is a little bit embarrassing is the migration policy. How on earth are we going to speak about anti-austerity and an economy for the many when there are detention centers all over the country where people are being treated the way they're being treated? Does the many not include all the women and men that are sitting in detention centers with their children, having no recourse to funds and being locked up? The question of borders and migration is fundamental to any anti-racist movement. And yesterday someone said, well, you know, let's be quiet about this because it's a contentious issue. Let's win the election, and after we win the election, everything will be fine. We can't build our entire politics on winning an election and shying away from being anti-racist. You're either anti-racist or not. And I'm saying this because, to be truthful, communities of color get promised things after elections all the time. It's the standard. After we win, things will be good for you. After we win, we will make things better for your communities. That's not good enough. And I think we need to challenge ourselves and we need to challenge the leadership on the wonky migration policy that exists at the moment. At a bare minimum, detention centers need to be closed. At a bare minimum, people need to have access to funds as their asylum applications are being processed, and that is at a bare minimum. And this is something we need to put forward boldly. We cannot be shy when the right wing is using racist language, completely twisting everything, blaming migrants for the economic situation. We can't hide under the tables and say, we're not going to tackle that issue, let's tackle it later. They will win every time we hide. And we only win if we actually fight. You can't just not have the fight, sit it out and say things will be resolved. And this takes me directly to something that others have already said. It's been really disheartening to hear labor leadership in various councils say, what we need is more policing in these communities. Because that is a fight we're always going to lose. And for communities of color, I live in Wood Green, I see young black and brown men and women coming out of high school being harassed every single day by the police. That is not about keeping our communities safer. There's nothing about it that's about keeping our communities safer. It's about controlling us, criminalizing us, and that is not what a labor movement needs to be putting forward. If we're transforming the world, we need holistic solutions. We need to look at things as health issues, as poverty issues. We need to empower our communities. If the Tories want to go write stories on chicken boxes, and I won't even get into how racist that campaign is, that's what they do. I think a labor movement needs to be putting forward something much more bold, much more honest about why these problems exist, and anti-racist. And the same goes for Islamophobia in this society. Islamophobia cannot be something that the labor movement deals with later, at a later point in time. And here, just going back to making sure that we shut down the PREVENT program is so crucial. As an educator, I am being asked by something like the PREVENT program to spy on my students, especially students of color, and if they look depressed or distracted during class, to report them. Now, I'm sure some of you have looked distressed and bored in class at some point in your life. Some of you look like that now. Imagine if that's what I have to do, if that's the sense of when we become police over each other. And that is really the dismantling of that history of our anti-racism, making us all spies against one another. And again, I don't think the labor movement has been bold in saying, let's tackle Islamophobia and let's shut down PREVENT. I didn't grow up in this country. I grew up on the other side. And when you grow up on the other side from a country that's still occupied, where a British man called Lord Balfour decided to sign it away without ever asking the people who lived there, you always know about British colonialism. You don't have to learn it, especially when you still live with the legacies of it. So it was really bizarre for me when I came to this country and realized, oh my God, people here don't know. They literally don't know about that history. So I've been really looking at the history of the anti-racist movement in this country and trying to learn. Because I think one of the most important things about being both an anti-racist and a feminist is to sometimes just shut up and learn. And looking at that history, there is remarkable strength that existed. These communities fought racism and fascism, but again, people don't learn about that. And I think part of our anti-racist principles and going back is opening up a space for that history again, making sure those activists who built those campaigns and protected those communities speak again. If we're going to speak about anti-racism seriously and transforming the world seriously, we need to ask who are the many and put the voices of the few out and the voices of the many who actually fought fascism forward. There's been amazing community organizing. We have resources to learn from. That's what needs to come through. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to the speakers for that really rich and deep account of both what was the structures of imperialism, the structures of racism in this country, but also touching on what we need to do about it. And some of the, let's call them recommendations for the labour movement about how it can begin to do that. I realised I didn't introduce myself. Someone just texted me to introduce myself. My name is Akram. I'm also a Palestinian organizer and migrant rights campaigner. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to have, because we've got quite a lot of time, we've got about 45 minutes, which is really great. I think maybe in keeping with the spirit of the session, if we can, I'll go for questions and contributions. And if some of the direction can be around these issues, perhaps if you think where you are, what kind of campaigning you've worked on, what are some of the questions you'd like to know, or some of the challenges that you face that you think are relevant to discuss in this arena. And I've seen already many experienced comrades in the audience today. And I'm happy also to respond on things around migration and anti-racism and other things. I'm just going to add myself to the panel, seeing as we've got the time for it. So I'll take 3 questions, contributions at a time, and then we'll... what's the mic situation? Is the second one working? Okay. Well, basically, if you're up at the top, you might just have to shout, and then I'll just pass this one round to whoever wants it.
I'm glad the last speaker raised Prevent. I live in Lambeth, where we have a very right-wing Lambeth Labour Council run by Progress, and they've just employed someone to run Prevent from the Henry Jackson Society, a leading light in the Henry Jackson Society, which for anyone who knows it is a right-wing Islamophobic neoconservative organisation, and this man's just been put in charge of Prevent in schools in Lambeth, which is something we're trying to take up in the Labour Party in Lambeth. But the question I wanted to ask was really about what the panel thought about the particular nature of the modern nationalist racist movement. Because I'm old enough to remember being part of the struggle against Enoch Powell when I was a student, and we spent our time in Birmingham trying to close down Enoch Powell meetings, not because we can characterise him as a fascist, but because he was so inflammatory that he encouraged the fascists that hung around his meetings and movement to attack immigrants, Asians and African Caribbeans. And I think today's It's just a question about today's nationalism, which seems to be a much broader, English nationalism or American nationalism. Because if you remember, in Britain, it really started with anti-Polish and anti-East European sentiment when they acceded to the European Union, and then it spread, as that, bolstered by the racist press, into a general anti-immigrant and nationalist movement. And I think, it fed into the war on terrorism, Prevent, then you got Trump and the rise of American white nationalism. And I don't think we should confuse this movement with, the fascists, who are a very specific type of movement. But it's probably more alarming that this new white nationalist movement is growing and has much more popular support than the actual small groups of fascists. And it's just a question, really, whether this is a new movement. I mean, we've always had anti-immigrant movements, but this seems very broad.
Is there another question? Yeah, comrade at the back.
Hi, just a small contribution. I'm a refugee caseworker, and I run a project with young asylum seekers within the Eritrean community. We sadly lost a number of young asylum seekers to suicide in the last year and a half, and this project was born out of that. And something that I experienced recently was I had a young person in my project approached me and asked for help to be moved outside of London because he was experiencing harassment all the time by the police, constantly being stopped and searched. And it was just something that we had to have a conversation about. It's like, how do we support these young people, most of whom are unaccompanied minors, to try and feel welcome in society when they're constantly being harassed by the authorities.
Hi, yeah. So my question is about Prevent as well, actually. So it's about thinking through what the panel thinks a progressive, anti-racist policy around safeguarding vulnerable individuals who've been drawn into terrorism would look like. And just to let you know, I'm sort of one of the Prevent officers in Brighton, and I come from social work around safeguarding. I take these concerns very, very seriously. So I genuinely would like to know, because it's a complex area and the government do get things wrong. So it's just about me sort of listening to everyone's views around that. Thank you very much.
And there was just one other in the middle, I think there was a hand. Yeah, that hand there. And then we'll do a round.
Yeah, I think that was an amazing discussion, but I feel like we should also acknowledge the fact that the UK does have an amazing tradition of anti-racism, whether you think about like the Battle of Pollution, Cable Streets, and on Friday on the student strikes, the students were chanting, "Refugees welcome here," when you talk about the question of climate change. And I think those anti-racist narratives are being a part of the movement, but we have to take it a step further. But I think it's also like the campaigns that people have been a part of, like the likes of Tommy Robertson, only being able to mobilise a couple of hundred this past couple of weeks. At the beginning, like over a year ago, he was able to mobilise 15,000 on the streets of London. And I think the fact that when he did his campaign in the Northwest, people were going wherever he went, and like who knew that milkshake would be the weapon of choice? Like it was absolutely, like I was fasting then, so it kind of irritated me to see food wasted. But like I was like, good, go for him. But the fact that like it narrowed him down to just 2%, and what he said is that wherever he went, people were calling him Nazi or calling him a fascist, and that's why he didn't win so many votes. And I think that's a tradition that we have in the UK. But the likes of Boris Johnson and the fact that he can attack Muslim women and not even apologise, saying that Muslim women who wear the veil look like letterboxes and so forth, and has refused to apologise. He's the UK's version of Donald Trump. But what is really showing that Islamophobia is such a norm and it's become a part of society. And I think with the question of Prevent, what it's really done, like, it's taken the voices away of Muslim students who are terrified to speak up and do anything or go on demonstrations because they worry what they will look like or how they will be perceived. And I think that's something we have to continue to do, is to fight on our campuses against Prevent and so forth. But I think it's created such a hostile environment where the Windrush generation can be targeted, but like when one form of oppressed groups are attacked, another is. You've seen the question of the rise of homophobia and hate crime. I think there is a massive step that we have to take, and I think we have to make sure that anti-racism is a part of everything, whether that be the question of climate change or austerity. But I think this is a great start, and yes, so thank you.
Maybe there's an order in which you want to take those questions. I might just respond to some of the things about Prevent, because that's come up quite a lot, and then we can go down the panel maybe. There's been quite a few meetings that I've organised in London around Palestine, and a number of Muslim student conferences I've attended and been at. And very often there's a Prevent officer at the back who asks a very similar question to this, seemingly benign and seemingly well-intentioned and not knowing what the problems around Prevent are. So I'm not suggesting the question is disingenuous, it's just that by now, perhaps some of the evidence might have arrived at the door of the Home Office for them to know what people are complaining about. And there's just one thing that I want to add about the Prevent programme, particularly why it's a problem, because people complain about it often, but it's very crystal clear. There are individual instances that people have reported on that demonstrate what the Prevent programme does. You know, terrorist house, writing this in a book, wearing this badge. The issue at hand is not individual instances, which we can go through. It's what it does structurally to people's lives. And so when you look at the cases that have appeared in the public sphere, for each one that we have, there are hundreds more that we don't have. Why? Because what people report on in Muslim communities is that it makes them afraid to say or do certain things. Now, the response by the Home Office is that this is accidental, it's teething problems with a great policy. If you go through the training of Prevent, it explicitly says, as Rafeef was saying, the most ridiculous, extraordinarily stupid suggestions about what contradictory as well, indicators of what terrorism is. So if you're restless, if you're shy and withdrawn, you might be being drawn into terrorism. If you're bold and confident with your views, you might be drawn into terrorism. If you look at the trainings, of which there are 7 or 8 different companies that offer this training to the Home Office, they offer a range of behaviour which any human being engages in the course of their normal life. So what the training does is, and when it's delivered to people, is it gives credence to their already racist, perhaps, views, emboldens their racist views, so they see every Muslim student in particular through the securitization lens. They report, rightly or wrongly, sometimes they're misreporting people. They say, oh, but there's not a problem. You've already told the student it's not legitimate to hold certain views. You've already told the student, not only is it not okay to, I mean, the examples in the literature say, if you're against the war in Iraq, if you support Palestine. These are some of the examples. It's not that people are misinterpreting the guidance or misinterpreting the training. It's there in black and white, which is being suggested to them. So I think that's where we have to say that it's not an accident of this policy, it's the intention of this policy. And I can give you hundreds of examples right from here, for students, of universities, of people in schools, of time and again of people not being able to book a room, having to fill in onerous, lengthy forms for very normal, usual speakers who've spoken hundreds of times at universities. This isn't an accident, it's the intention of the policy. And the way we fight against it, and the way we fight against all of the racist policies which are now being fed through public services, including the hostile environment stuff, is that we train and we support everyone who's engaged, being forcibly recruited to engage in these policies, but how they can counter it. And that's maybe another question I can get to in a second.
Very briefly as well, I know Arun Kudnani has just published a alternative to Prevent, which was launched in Parliament, I think, about 2 weeks ago, which is called... Remind me. No, you can't, can you? Arun Kudnani will Dan is going to tell me shortly what it's called, but he's gone through all of the prevent policies and not simply critiques it all really coherently, but has proposed really coherent alternatives, and it is called Leaving the War on Terror, a progressive alternative to counter-terrorism policy. And so Arun has been writing about this for a very, very long time, and has put together really useful alternatives. I'll leave the other stuff for you. I might say something very briefly, I guess, about policing and the harassment of young people and what we can do about it. I think the first, maybe I could ask you later, but whereabouts in London that the young person from Eritrea is from, because there are lots of youth groups in London that are organising to support young people experiencing this kind of harassment in a collective way that can hopefully prevent him from wanting to have to migrate again. And I think the second thing is that when it comes to statistics, a lot of the time, especially like racial disproportionality, is actually worse outside of London. So areas of policing like Dorset and Somerset and Devon actually have like far worse racial disproportionality than the Metropolitan Police. I mean, the half a dozen black people in Devon must be getting stopped every other week. So often we can feel as if the Met are the worst, but outside of London can be just as bad, if not, in some ways worse as well.
So just continuing on that question about the harassment of young people, I think it's similar to what Akram was saying about kind of training people who are on the front line of these things about how they counter it. Similarly, a real tragedy from the huge loss of youth services is that it has lost places where young people can go to be safe from the harassment of the state. And more, I know that people often advocate for the public health approach as a response to youth violence, but then what we've seen under Theresa May with Sajid Javid when he was at the Home Office was that they brought forward this statutory reporting obligation where now if young people are considered to be at risk of involvement in knife crime, they should be immediately referred to criminal justice services. And this has now recruited nurses, teachers, other public service workers into reporting on young people in places where they're supposed to be being supported. It's not that difficult to see the way in which this is a very similar strategy to prevent. It's a similar strategy to other ways in which these techniques are used, and then they are picked up and put forward to work on other populations for other problems that we have, like the problem of knife crime. So I think, again, when we talk about countering this, there's ways in which we can push for Labour to have a set of better policies on this and to actually get rid of things like knife crime prevention orders and statutory reporting, because we know that this is just about disciplining, punishing and controlling young black people, but also that actually we can build confrontation to that now through mass non-compliance. So that there are more and more places in which young people who are being harassed and who in places in which they're supposed to be safe, like schools and hospitals, are not afraid of being immediately referred to criminal justice services. An immediate result of this is that we now have young people sewing up their own stab wounds because they're afraid of going to the hospital because they think that the medical worker that they meet in the hospital is going to report them. So I think mass non-compliance is something which we urgently need, and that building that power on the ground will help us to put forward bolder and better policies and help young people be protected now from this kind of extreme state harassment. Just on the question of the modern nationalism and is it different, I think that it's not like we solved the problem of racism and nationalism and then it reared its ugly head again in 2008. I think there are lots of streams of continuity, and you see that in the kind of the narratives that they're using and the way in which they're organising. But I think one thing that we should be really mindful of, however we categorise these kind of far-right voices in our society, is that they are organising on an international scale. Like Steve Bannon is like coming over, right, and consulting on how we do this. And I think, going back to what was said about the importance of internationalism, if the nationalists are organising internationally, we should make sure that we're doing the same thing at the very least.
just to the person who spoke about the legacies of anti-racist organizing, that's sort of what I was trying to say at the end, probably not very articulately, that there is a long tradition and long history of anti-racist and anti-fascist organizing in this country. Quite often we think we're reinventing the wheel and starting new, and fascism was gone and now it's coming back. But there's a continuity, and everyone sitting on this panel is actually an anti-racist organizer, a migrant rights organizer. So the community is there. I just think on the sort of fringes of the Labour Party conference, I haven't seen anti-racism, internationalism, migrant justice be at the top of the agenda. And I want it to be not just at the top of the agenda, but integrated into everything and every policy that's being put forward. It's not like we can have anti-austerity here in one room where we're going to fix everything, but let's talk about migration and anti-racism later. It doesn't work, because the way the economy is being talked about by the right wing is all about migration. It's not strange that Boris Johnson is talking about Muslim women as letterboxes. This kind of language, I don't think the nationalism has changed. I think what has changed is how acceptable it has become in public discourse, that they can say it on television and get away with it. And the only way we're going to stop it is if we tackle it head on and put forward an anti-racist anti-austerity. We can't just be anti-austerity and hide our anti-racism away until there's a magical election. We're not going to win an election unless there's a clear message around migration and anti-racism. There was a question around Prevent and how to fix Prevent and how do we work in these communities. I just want to be very clear, Prevent is a racist program. Prevent is a program that criminalizes specific communities and gets us all to be police officers over each other. Some officers from Prevent came to my university recently and said, well, you guys have critiques, maybe you can help us fix this. I don't want to help anyone fix their racist programs. I would like these programs to end. And part of the problem we're having now is that certain places can stand up against it but are afraid to because it's become connected to funding. So if our universities don't train us in how to implement Prevent, then the funding for that university will be cut. And then that's how our employer threatens us. Our employer says, well, you're actually not going to have a job unless you implement Prevent. And the only way to actually take that on is to have a campaign across the country, across sectors, where the NHS workers are working with the university sector and every single sector where Prevent is meant to be implemented. Unless we do it together, it's going to fail. It's not going to be one workplace or one university. We need a strong national campaign where the students and all the workers at universities are coming together. We keep having spurts of energy around it. We have one meeting here and one meeting there that are excellent, but we really need a coherent strategy that we all build together. Unless we do that, I think it's going to be hard to prevent collectively. On how can we tackle issues within communities, I think communities are extremely capable of tackling issues if they're allowed to, but their voices have to be put first. It can't be that there's criminalization and racism and that's where the solutions are coming from. We are more than capable of having discussions if there's the space open for communities to actually take the lead.
Question time. We got 3 here. Maybe we can start there and then.
Hiya. My question was about eco-fascism. So we often think about the rise of racism in terms of when negative things happen in society. So austerity measures come in, people get more racist, and we see this happen. I was recently part of organising a migrant and climate justice camp, and there was one comment that came through on Facebook that said, "We don't understand why you're doing this. You're slowing down the process by trying to integrate migrant justice. We really need to focus just on climate." And I said, "Here's a link to our anti-oppression list. I suggest you don't come and you read it." So, because they were gobshite. But anyway, my point being, that one comment is actually something that, like, I'm sure many of us are more concerned about. So it's seen as this progressive movement. So if you talk about climate, you're deemed progressive, and so like thumbs up. But like how we make sure that mass movement of that doesn't equate to a mass movement of racism at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. It's kind of a question, but it's really about how we get more radical about community organising. We have elected members. This gentleman on my right talked about, the local council, which is a Labour council, essentially bringing in somebody that very much will act against communities. And that's where my starting point is. The agenda of this academic debate is not filtering down on community experiences. I'm from the north of England, a place called Rotherham, where we systematically failed young people who were raped. The failures were basically statutory sector, that was the council, the educational system, the police and the health service, who knew for many, many years that young girls were being raped as well as young boys, but did nothing. Black people locally were blamed. And one of those black people that was blamed, we had a murder, we had various people being attacked. The community had to respond to being besieged by the far right, not one or two marchers, we're talking 20 odd marchers to this date. And you can see how that breaks up communities, really kind of kills your spirit more than anything else. I became an elected member at that time because that was my call to do something. I was working nationally, I came back, went to part-time work, and that's when I faced and I understood racism in the Labour Party. And that's the crux of this issue is, it's in our party and we are not shifting it. When we supported, many of you may have heard of the case called the Rotherham 12, it was all of us on the front line. We had the police literally kettling us as if we were the outsiders and we were local people. Those marches radicalised people in our town, and it's led to kind of real, what we call danger for just people just going about normal business. The biggest racism I found was actually local elected members representing the Labour Party who had no conscience, no understanding of what the case was about, to the point where even they tried to do a vote of disrepute because I was a cabinet member for supporting the case and being a witness for the case. And I think that's the crux of the issue is how do we, whether it's training or development, but we need to be more ruthless about people's values who are representing our values as a Labour Party, because I could tell you, in the parts of the country that I come from and I work in, it's not happening there. So it's just a call out about what ideas do you have to have better representatives that actually support and mobilise communities on the agendas that you spoke about so eloquently earlier.
Hi, so I'm quite new to the UK as well, and what I was hearing from the panel is something that I've experienced myself. So I'm from Canada. So when I arrived here, I was very, very surprised to basically learn that the UK residents just didn't know about their history in Canada. So I'm a lawyer, I've been meeting a lot of legal academics, and some of them in the UK professor didn't know that our Bill of Rights is your Bill of Rights, so it's the same Bill of Rights, it's not two documents, which is a very simple thing, it's at the institutional level, just same legal systems. So I was extremely surprised at that fact, and I think that the panel talked about that, how much there's this disconnection from the history of the UK and how people have learned and internalized what has been happening in the UK for centuries. And then something that we've been doing in Canada, and I've been part of it in Quebec, is trying to change our educational system. So when we talked about systemic change, a lot of the talk that we've been having within our community and within our society was changing some of our history classes to incorporate, because the reflection in Canada was how we treated Indigenous people when settlers arrive, and it was just completely missing from our history classes, completely missing from our education. Whereas here we go, we arrived, some people were there, and then happily ever after, which is a big part of the history that was missing. And I felt coming here, there's also this big part of history that is missing in the educational system in the UK, or I might be misleading, but that's what I really felt coming here. So we had this huge movement coming through of changing the educational system to incorporate in different classes the history of the indigenous people and what we have done to them as well. We had residential schools, and it was very important to change the narrative of assimilation. It's not assimilation, it's genocide. So we've done a genocide here, and be frank about it. So I was wondering, because I didn't really hear anything, if there movement here or campaign to change the educational system in the UK to incorporate some of those elements, because I think that it needs to be incorporated if you really think about systemic change.
Thank you. Hi, I'm have Syrian heritage and Arab heritage, and it's very nice to hear a hint of West Asia in your voice. I'm terrified, but I'm going to just go ahead. And my question is kind of a personal one for all of you. I think in order to end racism or have an anti-racism movement, it's important to remember the personal ways that we've all been hurt by racism and how we internalize the messages that we receive if we're on the targeted end, and then also if we're on the end that's doing the targeting, you know, that we're all part of a systematic organized form of oppression. So when the state is coming down in the way that it has on these groups, you know, it takes away our, it makes us so afraid, you know, to speak out or to take action. And obviously each of you is up against that in some way, and yet here you are. And so just, I'd love to hear anything that you want to say about how you keep going in the face of those kinds of oppressions. Thank you.
Hi, so I just had a question around, so I do work around anti-racism in academia and universities, and Rafeef, you talked about bringing it to the top of the agenda when you're talking about prevent, and so just in the sense of bringing it to the top of the agenda when talking about anti-racism in an institution as big as academia and universities, and I found it to be so difficult because A, we don't have the power, generally we don't have the power to do that, we can't just single-handedly do that, and B, if we do get in the room, the language of equality and diversity that has like permeated academia is so non-radical that it is essentially useless. And then therefore the work that we're doing is seen as being radical rather than the necessary work that has to be done. And I've been in meetings where we've talked about equality and diversity strategies, and the people who speak the most are people that I know are overtly racist because they've been overtly racist to me. But they're rewarded because they use that language. And I've just found that there is some conversation around the curriculum that is, you know, people are starting to talk about that. When we say we're not just talking about that, we're talking about racism in the classroom, we're talking about overt racism, we're talking about, you know, connected radical solidarity to other issues that like migration, visa issues and things like that. They just can't comprehend it and they stop listening. So are there any ideas about having these conversations in spaces and big institutions like academia about that don't want to do the work?
Thank you very much for the question on the Labour Councils. I don't know if the person is still here. I live in a Labour Council area that was trying to privatise £2 billion worth of council, everything. They were trying to basically privatise everything from housing to the libraries to everything under the sun. And it's quite hard because we're in this tricky position now within the Labour Party, where things are changing, but they haven't fully changed. Things are shifting, but we have to make sure the shift happens. And it can't just happen at the leadership level, it has to happen throughout. And what was heartening about the campaign that was led in my council was it was a grassroots campaign, and we forced that council to stop that privatization from happening. People took pots and pans to the council meetings. We had beautiful, shows and events and poetry at the different pubs. And that sense of community and community organizing has really largely been lost through the turn to neoliberalism, but also, frankly, how the Labour Party has been for a very long time, where people didn't think they can get involved, and all of these spaces for communities to come together and fight back were being eroded. We got a lot more people actually going to the meetings to challenge the Labour Council. But again, you're in this tricky position where you want to do the challenging, but you don't know how far you can go. And I think we're all learning how to do it. In terms of racism in particular, I think, and anti-racism, I think those of us who generally support the anti-austerity project really need to more coherently put together the anti-racist project and fight for it. The history of the Labour Party is quite dotted when it comes to anti-racism, one has to say, and immigration policy. Sometimes we hide that under the table, under the carpet, or whatever the expression is in English. But I think we need to speak about that history and reckon with it if anything is really going to change. If there's no reckoning with that history of the internal racism within the party and how it has functioned, nothing is going to change. And you speak to a lot of activists of color and communities of color, and they say, well, until the leadership really proves itself in terms of racism, we're not rejoining. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think this meeting is a first step, or these types of meetings, or spaces like the World Transformed, is a first step to try and talk about this history and try to undo it together. It's not an individual task, none of us are going to fix it. It's going to take a lot of local organizing and national, both at the same time. But I think at least the conversation is happening, as opposed to 5 years ago where no one was even mentioning it, and we wouldn't have a room with this many people even having this conversation. And I think that's a step in the right direction. The question about the curriculum and academia as a space is really tricky. Because on one hand, I think sometimes we think everything is going to be fixed in academia and through education, and we need to realize it's an institution like all other institutions. It has its own structural racism, and I strongly believe in building our own educational spaces completely outside it, that don't have to do with what grade you get, that aren't premised on you competing with the person that's sitting next to you, actually alternative education spaces. The tricky part within academia is that it very quickly, like everything in capitalism, is allowed, it can take your radical language, regurgitate it back at you without any real change. So it was amazing that students were talking about decolonizing the curriculum. It was beautiful. It was a grassroots campaign. People really wanted it to happen, but very quickly it's become about diversity, adding a few black and brown names into your syllabus and everything will be fine. So we constantly need to make sure that once our language is stolen, that we're still pushing in the right direction. And that's exactly the type of work we have to do. But I strongly believe it can't just happen within academia. We have to build these spaces outside.
This is kind of an answer both to the question about ecofascism, also about organising in university and organising with Labour representatives who are being racist and who are not doing what they should be doing, which is kind of that. It is in these moments, and this is what you learn from the history of anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggle, which is that like no one is necessarily going to come and save us. And I think in all of these scenarios, the answer is that we have to organise and build power until these things are non-negotiable. It cannot be understood to be intelligible that you could be any kind of progressive leader if you did not have the kind of anti-racist politics that we want these people to have. And oftentimes it's incredibly disheartening when people we expect to be comrades don't actually live up to that. But ultimately, when we have those moments of complete disillusionment, we just have to continue to organise until it becomes a totally non-negotiable part of any progressive platform. I mean, I remember in 2015 watching the leadership debate between the election debate between Ed Miliband and David Cameron, And there was a question about, oh, well, Labour caused the deficit and how are you going to balance the books and da-da-da. And Ed Miliband like totally capitulated to it, right? He was like, oh, yes, I know we did, we spent too much money, but don't worry, we're going to do a little bit of this here and a little bit, we're going to be good with the money. And it was like, you're just going to, like a Tory is always going to beat you once you've capitulated to that claim. And now, I mean, not even just now, even like a year after that debate, that would have been completely unintelligible. And that was because of what had happened with organising in the Labour Party for Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign. And I think we have to make unintelligible these kind of racist politics and neglect and thinking that it can just be swept under the rug or that it can just be compromised on and left until after we win or after this. And ultimately that's just down to us to organise and to make it happen.
I guess, yeah, I think most of the questions have probably been covered, but I think relatively briefly, I think the thing about climate anti-racism is a really important question because we will not have a broad-based mass climate movement unless we see and build upon the connections that exist within different forms of struggle. So we have to understand that people who are campaigning, who are anti-war activists, are fundamentally linked to struggles against climate change. People who are fundamentally engaged in anti-racist campaigns, whether that be in our communities or elsewhere, it is fundamentally linked to questions of climate justice. These things are intimately connected. So whilst so on the one hand you have these people arguing, it's like, oh, we'll never have a mass movement if we keep talking about racism. We'll never have a mass movement if we keep talking about migration. No, it's literally the opposite. We have to understand these things are intimately connected in order to bring about a mass movement. Because for people in this country anyway, they're not experiencing the effects of climate change right now, right? And so very often, in order to bring people into the movement, it's far more practical to link it to problems that are in their immediate reality, right? And things that are in their immediate reality is not being able to pay their bills, being harassed by the police, having problems with accessing healthcare services, all of these types of things. And identifying the ways in which these kinds of problems are intimately linked with the imminent problem of climate catastrophe is the only way we're going to build a mass movement. The Labour Council's racist thing, I mean, yeah, I think totally. The London example is almost definitely gentrification, which is like so horrendously racist and it's being really led by Labour councils. And I think that we always have to keep in our minds that anti-racism is a radical project, it is a radical politics, and our parliamentary system is not set up for radical politics. That has to be something which takes place within our communities. So while electing Jeremy Corbyn as being Prime Minister and the Labour Party into power can enable him to provide resources and space and time and buildings and all of the kind of things that we need in order to have strong grassroots organisations, it has to come from the grassroots, including our anti-racism and indeed anything else. And so I don't want to say that the Labour Party will never change and never be an anti-racist party, but I think that the parliamentary system operates in such narrow parameters that the radical politics of anti-racism finds it very, very difficult to function within those narrow parameters. And so therefore that kind of anti-racist politics has to come from our communities and pressure and gather resources from those larger institutions such as the parliamentary system when it's necessary. Oh yeah, equality and diversity. I just boycott equality and diversity. It's like the worst thing ever. No, I can't.
Yeah, I was just going to add in on a couple of points. One about the history classes. And I know people have emphasised a lot the lack of information that there is in this country about Britain's colonial history. It's also important to emphasise what I know other panellists have worked on, which is, as an example, which is the Rose Must Fall campaign, where they asked for a very small statue to be removed off a college in Oxford. And that elicited enormous reaction from funders to the college saying they'd withdraw $60 million of an endowment to the college. Now, that's interesting, not because, obviously we've been speaking about colonialism today, but we understand it, but there are some people who are ideologically committed to it, to the extent that they're willing to threaten the college and their funding in order to maintain a piddling little statue. Of course, it wasn't about the statue, about what the statue represented. But nevertheless, we're not in a vacuum whereby there's just some old colonial ideas knocking around that we have to deal with. But it's a very live legacy, very live form of oppression that people are very committed to and endorse and can maintain that structure. And I think the flip side of people not knowing about the colonial history of Britain is people not knowing about the radical history of Britain. So for every time if you walk around London and you see the characters who have had statues created for them, it's a pretty disreputable list. And, people, and Rafeef gave an example of Lord Balfour, but I know that other people have been to universities around the country or walked around. As they wander around, they see old colonial generals who occupied their country and ran it for a very long time. That's who we're told to remember and to commemorate. And we are not told to remember people who live and are buried in anonymous graves around London, around the country, who are heroes of anti-racist struggle and who won every right that we have in this country. So unless we have that connection, I think it's going to be very difficult for people to understand the principles of anti-racist struggle or radical tradition that we need to bring back to life. On stuff on the Labour Party, which has been going around a bit, I just wanted to add one point which, there's a critique that many of us and most of us on the panel are going to share about what Labour does and does not say on the question of migration. I think part of my disappointment would be further that I understand why in the political climate at the moment the Labour Party might decide that certain positions they're not going to bang the drum about and put the forefront of their agenda. I think where it's particularly disappointing is that on top of that, they're not taking the stances that would enable a different direction to be taken. So what I mean by that is, one simple example is around NHS charging. Now, you don't have to go and say, let them all in and let them all use the NHS and we love them all and I'd like it if they did. But the Labour Party thus far has found it very difficult, even in principle, to say things like, there's a universal access to healthcare and we believe in that. So you could revert to another approach by talking about universal principle and saying this is what the Labour movement stands for. You don't have to get into the details of things that you feel are going to difficult problematically to raise. So I think that's where, whether the arguments and the policies that Labour is advancing have within them latent potential for opening up different kinds of discussion at this stage, and that's where we need to start from. And I think that ties into also the approach we're talking to our working in institutions, which is what can we do, what can we find in existing institutions and amongst existing individuals, which is something to hang this anti-racist message onto. So again, the healthcare workers as an example, they have oath they've taken, they have the duties of a doctor to their patient, not to charging them. People have, as educators, have duties to their students, which exist above and beyond their duties to report them to prevent. So within all of that, because obviously I want everyone to be banging the anti-racist drum with me, but actually within different principles, different professional standards, there are the principles in which our anti-racist movement has to collaborate and incorporate in order that everyone feels that they can make these arguments from different perspectives, from different points of view. And I think that's some of the work that we're talking about Prevent and other campaigns that we need to feed in and build into our racist organising. And just the personal story part, I love to talk about myself, so that's really good. We've got 5 minutes left. No, it's not long enough, but captured audience, so nothing to do, lock the doors. But I just, as you were talking, something just popped into my head, which was that, when I grew up in Palestine and I moved here at a certain age, about 13, the thing that I found most extraordinary was, the things that Rafeef mentioned about who didn't know their history, but how everything that I knew was quite different, was represented in a completely different way. So I know my family and my comrades and my friends and my community, what they think about the world and what they speak about, what they share, what they believe is beautiful, what they think liberation means, how they conceive of other people, what it is they struggle and they live through. And when I came here and heard the way it's spoken about in the media or represented, it was baffling as a child. And I think, I don't know, have a very coherent point around it, but I just think there's something in the complete misrepresentation of the lives that we live and what people are fighting for that is part of the problem here. So we end up snipping around the edges. It's like there's a demand for anti-racism. It's actually much richer and much more powerful and much more important than that. And I think that kind of, we need to break that. And part of what we've discussed today is not just the racism, but how it's made invisible, and how many people are made invisible in that process, in the fuller sense of what it means to be a human being. And we now have 5 minutes left.
That's a good, yeah, let's end on that. Yeah.
So we can end on that, and then there we go. Thank you.